A thread by Pat Scopoliti, 6 December 2020. MAGA analysis, hashtag MAGA victory 2020. We have already won. We shall return to Publius Hulda's guiding light today. We begin first with a fascinating analysis from a new thought leader I'd never heard of before yesterday. Check this out. A thread by Puissant. Pay attention, patriots, most important. New word to learn today. Vitiate. 1. To reduce the value or quality of, impair or spoil. 2. To corrupt morally, debase. See synonyms at corrupt. 3. To make ineffective a contract or legal stipulation, for example, invalidate. To make ineffective a contract or legal stipulation, for example, invalidate. Invalidate. Fraud vitiates everything, not just some. Everything. Period. Link in the thread, stateofthenation.co. Fraud vitiates everything. United States versus Throckmorton. The enduring opinion was the crux of the landmark decision handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in the above referenced case of the United States versus Throckmorton. Ipso facto, the outcome of a presidential election that is rife with one-sided fraud and criminality is rendered null and void, especially any result which saw the winner attain his or her victory through fraudulent means and or criminal conduct is automatically canceled and invalid under the law. The same U.S. Supreme Court ruling also determined that fraud vitiates contracts. An election is essentially a binding contract between the electorate and the elected. This indispensable social contract is irreparably broken through voter fraud, as the public trust is profoundly violated. Remember, fraud vitiates everything. The transparent, Democrat-directed election theft of 2020 has rent asunder the sacred covenant between the elected and the electors. Hence, Joe Biden's illicitly declared victory is illegitimate and therefore annulled forthwith. The Biden-Harris ticket has also forfeited any right to a recount or a rerun of the election because of their highly organized and premeditated fraud perpetrated to outright steal it. Remember, fraud vitiates everything. As more details of this unprecedented vote fraud and election theft are brought to light, the Trump-Pence ticket appears to have won by a landslide. The fraudulent Biden wins in the battleground states were actually stolen from Trump, so the result is reversed, but by much more than the vote tallies indicate. President Trump is therefore the victor of the 2020 presidential election by default, by law, and according to the U.S. Constitution. By every indication, his electoral triumph was sealed by the will of the great majority of the American people. Fraud vitiates everything. Everything else is a distraction. Conclusion and caveat. This crucial declaration is actually an extremely important notification. It has been released for the benefit of each and every attorney in the United States of America working on the Trump versus Biden case. While most of those state lawsuits focus on the minutia of Biden's election theft, it is critical that the president's lawyers not lose sight of the big picture presented here. While it is essential to ferret out the facts of the Democrats' election crime spree across the country to legally prove fraud, at the end of the day, all that matters is that fraud vitiates everything. Everything else is a distraction. In other words, once any or all of those intentional frauds have been proven in court, whether by judge or jury, the so-called Biden victory will be vacated for all time. Once the Democrats' nationwide criminal enterprise has been established, via successful lawsuits, even by one litigation, Donald Trump ineluctably wins the 2020 presidential election. The U.S. Supreme Court has set a loud and clear precedent ruling that fraud vitiates everything. The president's attorneys and all involved law firms need to be acutely aware of this Supreme Court decision that was handed down in the landmark case United States versus Throckmorton, 98 U.S. 61, Supreme Court, 1878, and which emphatically stated that fraud vitiates everything. In light of this vital information, which could very well dictate the final outcome of the 2020 presidential election, State of the Nation respectfully requests that this post be posted and sent out far and wide. Please disseminate this urgent notification, especially throughout the Patriot Movement legal community. Thank you. State of the Nation, November 8th, 2020. Landmark case, United States versus Throckmorton, 98 U.S. 61, Supreme Court, 1878. Precedent. Knowingly. In other words, once any or all of those intentional frauds have been proven in court, whether by judge or jury, the so-called Biden victory will be vacated for all time. United States versus Throckmorton, 98 U.S. 61, 1878. Appeal from the Circuit Court of the United States for the District of California. Syllabus 98 U.S. 61. Link in the thread supreme.justia.com. United States versus Throckmorton, 98 U.S. 61, 1878. The general ground on which this relief is asked is that both these decrees were obtained by fraud. Page 98 U.S. 62. United States versus Throckmorton, 98 U.S. 61, 1878. Precedent, quote, supposed to impeach the decree and is correspondingly silent as to anything tending to its support. There are important facts which, it cannot escape attention, could not be omitted. It is true that the United States is not bound by the statute of limitations as any individual would be. Where the unsuccessful party has been prevented from exhibiting fully his case by fraud or deception practiced on him by his opponent, as by keeping him away from court, a false promise of a compromise, fraud vitiates everything, and a judgment equally with a contract, that is, a judgment obtained directly by fraud and not merely a judgment founded on a fraudulent instrument. The principle and the distinction here taken was laid down as long ago as the year 1702 by the Lord Keeper in the High Court of Chancery in the case of Tovey versus Young. The maxim that fraud vitiates every proceeding must be taken, like other general maxims, to apply to cases where proof of fraud is admissible. That the mischief of retrying every case in which the judgment or decree rendered on false testimony, given by perjured witnesses, the reason of this is obvious, namely, that in so important a matter as impeaching the grants of the government under its seal, its highest law officer should be consulted and should give the support of his name and authority to the suit. For these reasons, we are of the opinion that the decree of the Circuit Court sustaining a demurrer to the bill and dismissing it on the merits was right. Decree affirmed. Page 98, U.S. 71. Pat continues. I just followed Puissant, and I'm recommending you should too. Let's talk about her guidance. Fraud vitiates. Joe Biden has attempted to defraud the 2020 election. He has been caught. That defaults to Trump's absolute victory. It's the law. This is what Trump is telling us. This is what Puissant is telling us. I'll leave the term vitiate to her thread. In our terms, Biden lost due to cheating. Cheaters, when caught, lose. That's how it works. Our nation is not only legal, it's logical. Cheaters lose. Hang with that. You cheat, you lose. As we move forward as a nation, as our glorious MAGA movement, it is absolutely critical that we claim the high ground. Morally, ethically, patriotically, we won this election in two ways. By the vote, it was a landslide. By the cheat, Biden is disqualified. Before we pick up on Publius Hulda's critical guidance again, honor must be given again to David Shestokas, who brought her work to our attention. After he and I last spoke, this was the article he offered for our homework from shestokas.com, the web of law, international, natural, common, constitutional statutes, and regulations. So, I take my first study pause. I have read this article twice before and will now read it for my third time. I need this framework now, and I urge you, so do you. Halfway through the article, and I'm seeing a series of podcasts that Shestokas and I need to do. One series would just be this article. There would be others to follow. What do you say? Want to see us tear this stuff to shreds and build it back up again? We'd rock it. Naming idea. The lawyer and the layman discuss the law. Again, what do you think? Back to reading now. And here, I thought I hated international law before. Now, fie and tarnation, I learned that my very nation is merely a conglomeration of states conjoined by some strange form of international law into a nation. He always does this to me, like always. This I knew already. I do not like regulations. I don't even like the idea. I am no New Deal kind of guy. FDR is not my hero. Okay, I support World War II. We won't talk about that right now. I don't like bureaucracies. I get that we need them, but less, not more. Less power, not more. I quote, you decide. The granting of power to an executive agency to make law is called a delegation of legislative authority by the legislature. At one time, the power grant was thought unconstitutional as violating the separation of powers. As society became more complex and details regarding many things, such as the FDA's rules for approving new drugs, were thought beyond the capabilities of legislatures to deal with such detail, courts began to accept this practice. Many still consider it to be unconstitutional, though the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that such delegations are an implied power of Congress. Here's what led me to my question to David Shestokas. I didn't get the U.S. Code as versus Publius Hulda's framework of statutes. I still don't quite yet. I draw closer. But Dave will tell you I'm not an easy student to guide. Thanks, Dave, for this article. It helps greatly. Before we turn back to PH and her roadmap, I owe her two documents of study, Federalist 10 and Federalist 78. Are you settled in for a long session? Federalist 10 comes next. I just finished Madison's first long paragraph in Federalist 10. I have to ask you, do you know how to read writings like this? I say flat out, I do not, other than to say repeatedly. There's a general idea I'll share, but the words themselves are sacred and I am unworthy. The first sentence. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. I'm pausing my reading to comment. Why does Publius Hulda send us here? This is the very thinking that informs our nation itself. If we fail to read this and think it through, we're not worthy citizens. It is that profound, that clear, that simple. You must read. Property as a right. This paragraph must be quoted. Quote, the second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. And from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respected proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. End quote. The word for all of this is sober thinking, real thinking, logical thought that articulates itself one step at a time and that takes 20 times longer in the reading and understanding than it took in the writing. But to write something like that paragraph takes a lifetime. Back to reading. Quote, a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. End quote. This was published on Friday, November 23rd, 1787. We could easily emplace the year 2020 and find no loss of pertinence or relevance. Wow. Quote, the inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects emphasized. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. End quote. I have to stop reading now. I got it. A republic must be ready to clog the administration or convulse the society, but a faction cannot execute or mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. As Publius Hulda shows us, studying the Constitution and studying the Federalist Papers is the work of a lifetime. We won't get this done today. Not Federalist 10, obviously not Federalist 78, not today. So after a coffee break, let's get back to the article itself, yes? Here's Publius Hulda's Hereinafter PH article yet again. In previous days, we've made it through the first part to about number 3, the statutory framework. Quote, Congress understood there would be fights in the states over the selection of the electors, so they provided for the fights, end quote. Oh, here's the link to the article itself again. I'm not sure yet, but this may be the most important article I've ever read relative to the constitutional republic in which we live. From renewamerica.com, a constitutional roadmap for conquering election fraud. So, as David Shestokas explains, we have natural law, the Constitution, written laws as recorded in the United States Code, and a statutory framework that devolves therefrom. PH tells us, quote, so we see that flexibility to deal with fights in the states over the selection of electors is built into the U.S. Code, end quote. I hate doing this. I do, but I have to bring in another source now. Please be patient with me. Check out what General Flynn guides us toward here. On December 5th, General Michael Flynn tweeted, everyone needs to pay very close attention to this short video explanation by Mark V. Serrano. We, the people, will choose the next president of the United States, and it will be President Trump. Hashtag stop the steal. Hashtag fight like a Flynn. Homework? Yes. Here is the white paper referenced in the video. If you have enough coffee, please read this too. Link in the thread from mma.prnewswire.com/media/1359230. Check it out. Damn, I hate when I lose the digital count. I confess I too often do. Let's see if I can straighten out. There is an 8-page white paper we should all read, posted by Mark V. Serrano. Link in the thread. Here's the headline. Set in stone? Question mark. A historical, constitutional, and legal examination of Electoral College deadlines and their implications for the 2020 presidential election. Skipping everything in between, here's the conclusion, but please read the entire paper on your own. Quote, because the laws governing the conduct of elections were flagrantly violated in numerous states during the 2020 presidential election, there can be no determination of presidential electors pursuant to state law. As such, the Constitution makes clear that the responsibility rests with state legislatures to appoint electors. This should be done as expeditiously as possible, but the only deadline state lawmakers have an obligation to meet is the one deadline set forth in the Constitution: noon on January 20th, 2021, end quote. After one more short break, we will dive into Publius Hulda's article in hopes of finishing it right now. Right now, know this: we have already won. It was a massive landslide. We will not allow this to be stolen from us. We have plenty of time. Now, we have to try to finish up with Congress has the power to determine whether the president-elect and vice president-elect are qualified for office. Election fraud is a federal crime and the duty of the Supreme Court. State legislatures should appoint replacement electors. And a warning. Quote from, I believe this is from the article, Congress has the power to determine whether the president-elect and vice president-elect are qualified for office. This is the greatest nation in the history of the world. Our founders get that credit. This item demonstrates why. Imagine any other previous nation whose Chamber of Congress had the power to determine if the reigning power was qualified. This is why the rest of the world models its democracies upon ours. Hear this, quote, Congress also has the power and the duty to disqualify Biden and Harris on the grounds that the fraud bringing about their sham election was an attack on the state's right, guaranteed by Article 4, Section 4, to have a Republican form of government, end quote. I often speak about how our constitutional republic was stolen from us dating back to 1913. In the years of my education from 1967 to 1981, I never heard the term a Republican form of government. Imagine that. Let's go slowly again. Republicans are a party. A Republican form of government has nothing to do with political parties. Who knew that? I sure didn't. And Democrats are a party. Democracy has nothing to do with a political party. On our side, we often say we're not a democracy, we're a republic. This is only partially true. Democracy matters. It is the only way that monarchy or the tyranny of the rulers may be defeated. The rule of the majority is the answer to the rule of the minority. That's what democracy is. The majority rules. The thing is, in reality, the majority is never merely just the majority. It is what the minority of those in power persuade the rest of their followers is in their own best interest. That's how it becomes a tyranny. Thus, in America, for the first time in history, we overcame both. We employed the majority to overcome the tyranny of the minority. We employed a republic to overcome the tyranny of the majority. Now that is pure genius, and within it, we find the basis of our freedom from 1776 until now. What does PH tell us is the way forward today? Election fraud is a federal crime. Biden and Harris are criminals. No, certainly. Attorney General Barr is not up to the task. Be clear on that point. But that he is corrupt does not remove the burden from the DOJ, alas. No need to linger. How do we address the full corruption of our federal apparatus when such evildoers as of Barr run them? PH tells us the duty of the Supreme Court. SCOTUS rightly has no enforcement capability. Its sole power is that of judgment. So, quote, the Supreme Court must issue an opinion consistent with Article 4, Section 4, which, when enforced by the executive branch of the federal government, solves the present crisis. Let's finish our work for today by returning to the Constitution itself as PH guides us. Article 1, Section 4. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. Take that in. Work on it. We're at the heart of congressional power and duty here. Can America be defrauded of a landslide election? The powers that oppose us within believe we can. Our enemies within have made their bet. You can fool a vast majority of Americans. They bet. I say we cannot be so fooled or defrauded. So, following Mark Serrano's paper, I'm absolutely ready to wait until January 20th. We'll see what happens. And with Puissant 1, I'm ready to declare victory now. How about you? This thread ends at 65. Not only do we have Federalist 78 to still consider, but I imagine we'll have some further PH thinking to finish up with tomorrow as well. Until then.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.